85 to 90% of your returns come from asset allocation.
Last few years, a lot of them took very significant exposure to equities, sometimes even as high as 60-80%. Can you give us the fundamentals of how to really think about asset allocation?
Don't have 100% in equity.
A lot of people build their portfolios thinking that we will stay invested, like the Warren Buffett approach, invested for decades.
Warren Buffett himself sells 85% of what he buys within 2 years, 50% within 6 months. So he doesn't buy and forget. Nobody knows which will be the multi-baggers in advance. I always say that hold rating exists in the world for only one reason, which is endowment bias. Because not buy something today, there's no reason for you to hold it.
How often should one look at their portfolios in terms of selling a stock, and what are the right framework to think about?
So investing is a loser's game. You have to play it not to lose. Not to hit the sixes, that should not be the objective. Your objective is not to get out. So we became members of the London Stock Exchange in 1999. We were not just the first Indian, we were the first Asian members. People think global means that you buy Nasdaq or S&P, or you buy 7 US stocks and the 4 Chinese stocks you know the names of. That is not global diversification. Stocks are not something you should fall in love with. Their objective is only to make you money. When I started working, the dollar was 12 rupees. You can't forget that this is how the rupee depreciates. That in the course of less than a career, the rupee has depreciated 90%.
Then how does one really think about asset allocation? Hello and welcome everyone to the India Opportunity Show. I'm your host Shrishti, and today I have with me someone who's deeply respected in the stock markets, Ms. Devina Mehra, the founder and chairperson of First Global, a firm that has invested across 75 countries and thousands of securities over the last 3 decades. She is someone who identified multi-baggers such as HDFC and Amazon many years ago before they became big names. To an extent, Jeff Bezos sent her a personal note thanking her for supporting him when Amazon stock was getting brutally beaten down. What I personally admire about Devina is that she has zero interest in market narratives or hype, and she is blunt to the fact and focuses on data and numbers. In this conversation, we go deep into the fundamentals of asset and portfolio allocation, how to think about India versus global markets, and how to build your portfolio for resilience and long term. Hope you enjoy watching. India is one of the fastest growing large economies across the world. And if you want to be a part of this growth story, you need to be backing Indian businesses and companies. Whether you already invest in markets or are just starting out, Grow is the place to be. Grow gives you a clean, simple, and intuitive investing experience which is unlike anything else out there. You can invest in stocks, mutual funds, IPOs, ETFs, bonds, and even commodities all in one place. You can track your portfolio performance, sector-wise distribution, and get a comprehensive view of your entire portfolio all with just a few clicks. No wonder Grow is now India's largest stockbroker with over 1 crore active investors. Check out Grow. Hi Devina, welcome to the India Opportunity Show. Thank you for doing round 2 with me here today.
Thanks for having me.
You know, for audience's context, I think we are both Lucknow girls. We both went to Loreto Convent and we have a mutual love for the stock markets. So I'm really excited to talk to you today.
There are not many Lucknowites with a love for the stock market.
I know, right? And nothing has changed. Every time you're there, it's still the same. But, you know, there is this big sense of shift coming in India. In terms of, you know, last few years, everyone was talking about India, the India opportunity. And now suddenly in 2026 or last part of 2025, we were seeing, you know, new global products coming in. But you're someone who's been doing global investing for decades. I would love to go deeper into that and talk about, help the audience understand the nuances behind building a global diversified playbook for themselves.
Okay, first of all, let me tell you how we went global as First Global. And this was back in the 90s when nobody had thought of going global. So one trigger was the Asian crisis, because there was, for most of your viewers, it is something in the history books, but I lived through it, which was about 25, 26 years ago. All the high growth Asian economies went through a crisis where their markets fell and their currencies fell. So in dollar terms, their markets fell between 50 and 90%. I mean, 90% was Indonesia. And when I used to work for Citibank, I'd spent some months in Indonesia, so it was kind of close home. I said, today, if I was an Indonesian, 90% of my net worth would be wiped out. So that was one trigger. The other was I said, I'm just bored of doing the same old company, so I want to do some other companies. And that's how I went global. Of course, nobody's thought this could be a success in the sense people said that if you're going to big markets like US and Europe and UK and all that, who's going to listen to you? Because you have all these old firms who've been doing it for decades. And but the heartening part was that if you do good work, it gets recognized.
Yeah.
So we became members of the London Stock Exchange in '99 when we were not just the first Indian, we were the first Asian members. Excluding Japan, only the Japanese firms had gone west, so it was as long back as that. But RBI did not even have a category to set up a foreign subsidiary for a non-bank, so they had to create a category for us. And then the US Broker Dealer Association, NASD, we became members by beginning of 2001. So that was then. But I mean, global markets and global companies are far more complex. That's been the learning in all these years. And the list of companies themselves change. So in the early 2000s, when we started covering US tech meant Dell, Motorola, IBM, Cisco. People forget Cisco was once the highest market cap company in the whole world. And then you know, now all those companies are not very relevant. I mean, they're still around, but they're not the companies you think of when you say tech majors.
Yeah.
Only Microsoft was a tech major then, and it's a tech major now, but that's the only exception. So so the reason, of course, as I said, to go global, one was that you should not put all your eggs in one basket. Or the other statistic which I give is that when I started working, the dollar was 12 rupees. So if you are talking, you know, all financial planning is around financial goals. And typically these financial goals are 10, 20, 30 years hence, maybe even longer. You can't forget that this is how the rupee depreciates, that in the course of less than a career, the rupee has depreciated 90%. So that's why it should be a significant portion of your portfolio. Logically or objectively, it should be even higher, but at least it should be 30, 40%. But having said that, I mean, right now, it is that people are driving, looking at the rear view mirror, saying last year India has not given returns. But if I had been global, I would have got returns. If I had been in gold, I would have got returns. Yeah. So now let me go into gold and let me go into globals. But that's not the right way to do it. It was the reverse in 2022. I remember people telling me, why did you ask us to diversify globally? India gave better returns. You know, global markets didn't do well. So it is not something you should fiddle around with that much. So it should be 30, 40% over a period of time of your allocation. But also remember that US is not the globe. People think global means that you buy NASDAQ or S&P, or you buy the 7 US stocks and the 4 Chinese stocks you know the names of. That is not global diversification. It may have worked off late because the markets were very narrow in globally, and only those 7, 8 stocks did very well. But that's not always the case. And US is not the world, which is one thing people forget, that you think that it is okay to going global means buying the NASDAQ or the S&P or just half a dozen US stocks you know of, or the 4 Chinese stocks you know of. But that's not true global investing. And also because US has done so well in the past dozen years or so, people think the world market is determined by how the US market does. But that again doesn't hold in all periods of time. So if you go back, let us say 2003 to 2007, that's one period when the US markets didn't do well, and they weren't coming off a high. They were already at a low, just coming out of that big tech crash, but they still didn't do that well. Whereas the emerging market index went up 3.5, 4 times in that period. India went up 6 times. Went up 6 times after 9 years of giving no returns. Then in 4.5 years, it went up 6 times. Brazil went up 10 times. And that's when, the stories always follow. So then the story became the US is over, and now it's the century of the BRICS. So BRICS itself, the acronym was coined at that time. Yeah. So every time you are talking just trying to explain what's happening today. So you need a truly global portfolio, which is all geographies and all assets. And because this is a cause for me, I think Indians don't invest globally or don't invest enough globally. We have an investment product which invests across the globe in all assets that starts at $10,000. 2 years back it was 7.5 lakh rupees. Now it is 9 lakh rupees, but still. And so that would be my thing. My worry right now is that because India has not given returns, there are a number of global products being launched in Gift City or otherwise. And suddenly everybody is an expert in global investing.
Yeah.
And it is not so simple to become an expert in global investing. And even if as a mutual fund you have invested in half a dozen stocks for 5 years, global stocks, doesn't make you an expert either. So be very careful when picking someone as a fund manager, whether they really have expertise or not, because otherwise it just becomes another thematic fund sale, that there is a market for it right now. People are frustrated with India. They're looking globally. So let me launch a global product, just as you launched a defense sector fund or a small cap fund last year.
Yeah.
It is the same thing.
That's so true because it's happening consistently. And, these thematic funds have also exploded in the market, be it defense or be it small cap funds. And now the global products that are going on coming. But, you always talk about that the real returns always come from asset allocation.
Right.
So can you give us like the fundamentals of how to really think about asset allocation?
Okay. So first of all, let me just briefly address that thematic fund bit, because this is not anecdotal. This is actual data over 25, 30 years. If you plot where all the thematic funds on a particular theme come, it is almost invariably just before the peak of that theme.
That's true.
Because
That's when the market really starts pumping in money.
Yeah,
and
that's when, the last person on the street comes to know of it, and then there is a FOMO feeling that my friend made money in whatever category. And as I said, this goes back 25 years. If you even look at the old fund, when the IT funds came in, when the pharma funds came in, right up to these PSU funds and defense or XYZ theme, it's almost invariably at the very near the peak of the theme. So that is actually, you can use it as a thumb rule as to which theme is about to peak by looking at where the cluster of thematic funds are coming. And it's not as if the asset management companies don't know this. They know this, but they know it's easy to gather assets. And then when it goes down, I've heard the CEOs of AMCs say this, that we only gave you a choice. It was your choice to invest in that theme. So coming back to asset allocation, yes, I always say that investing is neither as simple nor as complex as people make it out to be. So you don't need to be an expert and say that I need to know how to find multi-baggers before I start to invest, because 85 to 90% of your returns come from asset allocation. And asset allocation sounds like a fancy word, but it is just categories of assets. Yeah. So equity means direct equity, as well as equity you hold through mutual funds or PMSs or whatever. Fixed income is a gamut from your tax saving schemes and fixed deposits up to fixed income mutual funds. Then there is real estate, there's gold and precious metals. You could have something in crypto or any other alternative assets. And usually the part that is missing in people's asset allocation is the global part. So asset allocation doesn't mean only asset allocation within India. And within the equities also, the sectoral allocation matters more than the particular stock. So this, since we are around the new year, first look at what your current asset allocation is like. A lot of people don't know that, first of all. And I'm talking even HNIs and family offices often don't know that. I've had family offices say that, I think we are mostly in global bonds. And then when you actually tally up the number, the biggest weightage is Indian real estate. So it could be anything. So first know where you are. And just as in a Google map or anything, you first need to know your starting point. You can't just put the destination. So if you get this broad thing right, that is good enough for most people. So don't tinker around with it every day. Don't think that should I now time this or time that, whatever, let us say, is your equity allocation, most of the time it makes sense to remain invested. But don't have 100% in equity. That's also extremely important, that you should not have 100% in equity, because equity is money you should not need for the next 8 to 10 years. So only that money should go there. So sometimes people say, I'm 25, I'm in a good job, should I be 100% in equity? No, because you don't know, there might be a medical emergency, you might want to study further, you might lose your job, you might want to put down payment on a house, so there might be money you need to withdraw.
Yeah.
The flip side to that risk in asset allocation, which I have written about, I think that article has not come out yet, that is that people say that at retirement you should be near 100% in fixed income, which is also a wrong advice. So just as you should not be 100% in equity when you are young, you should not be 100% in fixed income just because you are retired. Because now life expectancy is high. You could be alive for 30, 35 years after retirement. And so your needs need to be taken care of. If you are only in fixed income, you would not cover the inflation in your living cost. So what you need to withdraw in the foreseeable 4, 5, 6 years, yes, you should not be in equity because you don't know. Because equity, the issue is, while there is some visibility to very long-term compounding, there's no visibility to compounding over 2, 3, 4 years. So if the down years come first and you are withdrawing out of that corpus, your capital itself goes down. So you should not plan to withdraw out of your equity corpus for the next at least 5, 7 years. So whatever you need for that should be in fixed income. But you should have a significant portion in equity. I mean, if you're retiring at 60, you have to plan till 1995.
Yeah.
So it's a long time to plan for.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are some good guiding principles that you've shared with the audience. But, in 2026, where everything already feels too expensive, right? Like gold has had a rally. Even Indian public equity markets are richly valued, barring a few sectors. So then how does one really think about asset allocation? If we are thinking about 30, 40% going in global out of your equity allocation, can you give us some more insights into how one should plan their allocation?
See, first of all, I don't think the Indian markets are particularly richly valued. If you look at even a crude measure like PE. So first of all, index level PE has no meaning because the index composition has changed so much over the years. 20 odd years ago, we didn't have banks in the indices at all. Now they are the highest weighted banks and financials. And in the late 90s, the indices were full of PSUs. In between, people forgot that PSUs are listed and are available for investment. So it goes to those kind of extremes. But if you look at the sectoral PEs, we are not at the highs. We are often even a little below average. So it's not, again, you're just looking for explanation as to why the market did not give returns for a year. So maybe, it's too expensive now. When last year meaning 24, I used to talk to up to August or so, when you were talking even to family office level people, they were saying, why are you talking of risk management? We want to take high risk and get high returns. The only thing certain with high risk is high risk of losses. No one is guaranteeing the high return. No, you are too conservative. Why do you say risk management first? So, and now it is the reverse. In fact, I would say, now you are in a better position simply because, and this is not my opinion, this is data from all research studies in many countries in the world, that sentiment is a contraindicator. When everybody is very happy that returns are there for the taking, as I said was the case in 24, that's when the next period returns are below normal, as was the case for the last Samvat. 24 Diwali to 25 Diwali, you got no returns. Whereas now if I see the talking heads on TV or on digital, everybody is talking about the risks. So then enumerating the risks, they're saying it's too expensive. So that's normally a contraindicator. So when the thought comes to in your mind that should I now stop the SIPs and should I get out of the market, that's normally the time when you should grit your teeth and remain invested. It is when you're feeling too good that money is very easily made, that's when you should be more cautious, which is against what your kind of mind is telling you. So that's the tough part. On the other hand, doesn't mean that you will make back the money in the same stocks that you're currently holding. That's a trap. But every bull market leaves debris behind. stocks which will never come back in fashion.
Yeah.
So, because I mean, so many stocks have practically gone to zero. I mean, two-thirds of the entire listing in the Indian market don't trade anymore. Two-thirds of the stocks listed don't trade anymore. So one of the other New Year resolutions which I talk about is that go beyond the first page of your DP statement. There'll be pages and pages of stocks you don't want to look at anymore, but they are the ones you must look at and get rid of in most cases.
That's true, because a lot of people build their portfolios thinking that we will stay invested, like the Warren Buffett approach, right? Like invested for decades, 10, 20, 30 years.
What they think is the Warren Buffett approach.
So
because Warren Buffett himself sells 85% of what he buys within 2 years, 50% within 6 months. So he doesn't buy and forget. You only think that he buys and forgets.
Yeah, but this whole narrative about consistent compounders, etc., has been on people's minds, and that's why they want to identify those kind of opportunities. But then how often should one look at their portfolios in terms of selling a stock, and what are the right frameworks to think about?
Okay, first of all, anyone who tells you that they have this magic formula for getting multi-baggers is fooling you. I mean, that you take it in writing from me. That even Warren Buffett in his 75-year career, Charlie Munger, the year before he died, said, in our entire career, if you take away the 10 stocks that did the best, or maybe 12, our entire performance will be gone. But you don't know in the beginning which those 10 or 12 stocks of. If you did know, then you would be invested only there. But no investor, no fund manager in the world has ever had a track record of even 50% multi-baggers, let alone 100% multi-baggers. Nobody has 50% multi-baggers. So sometimes people come to me also and say that you identified HDFC Bank in 96 or Amazon in 2001, which is today's Amazon or HDFC Bank that I can buy for my child and leave for 20 years. I said, nobody has this crystal ball.
Yeah.
Nobody knows this in advance. So that you cannot forget that. So you have to buy as per some sensible system, but still you'll have to buy 25, 30 stocks. Out of that also, 6, 7 will turn out to be complete duds, meaning they won't do at all what you expect them to do. And of the rest, hopefully they'll make reasonable returns. And if you are lucky and if you've chosen well, maybe 2 or 3 will be multi-baggers. But nobody knows which will be the multi-baggers in advance. All the stocks you think of now, Amazon, Apple, Tesla, this Richard Branson's Virgin, all these major stocks also went close to bankruptcy at various times. Rakesh Jhunjhunwala's biggest winner, Titan, if you read the book, there's a book called The Tanish Story written by Titan CEO. And the biggest takeaway for me was that 3 times that business came close to being shut down, the jewelry business. They made such big strategic blunders. There was regulatory changes. So it could just as well have been shut down. So nobody knows in advance. If you'd met Rakesh over the years, every time he would tell you story of some new stock.
Yeah.
So he wouldn't also know which stocks of his would become multi-baggers, which was Titan, CRISIL, Lupin, and I think 1 or 2 others. So nobody knows this in advance, that which will be the multi-baggers. But as I said, get your broad asset allocation right in terms of when to sell. If you want first of all, you said how often to look at the portfolio. We normally look at it every quarter. I mean, we might make some changes during the quarter, but the big thing we do every quarter, and that is really the base zero rebalancing, saying if we had cash today, where would we be? Because one thing which is there are many biases which are very hardwired into us, and one of them is the endowment bias, that we value something more highly simply because we hold it.
Yeah.
So I always say that the hold rating exists in the world for only one reason, which is endowment bias. Because theoretically, if you will not buy something today, there's no reason for you to hold it. So always use that test, that will I buy this stock today at today's price? If not, get rid of it. Otherwise, in terms of a general framework, first, when you buy a stock, don't say that I will sell it if it doubles or triples, because that means you will miss out on the multi-baggers. But always have a trailing stop loss. So trailing stop loss means, suppose you buy something at 100 and you have a 25% trailing stop loss. So it doesn't mean that your trailing stop loss is now fixed at 75. But you buy something at 100, it goes to 90, it goes to 150, it goes to 135, you keep holding it. It goes to 200, you keep holding it, 300, goes back to 270, you keep holding it, goes to 400, and then it comes back to 300. So it's now 25% down from the top. That's when you sell it. So it will sometimes happen that the stock will again start moving up, but that's fine. But on the average, it will save you money. And also forget about this whole transaction, because at times you might buy that same stock at even a higher price.
Yeah.
But on the whole, this is keep to the discipline of a stop loss. Get out when things, and otherwise you can just let it run unless a stock becomes a very large percent of your portfolio. As sometimes, for example, this is a question even yesterday somebody asked me that, when you have ESOPs, typically that becomes a outsized portion of your net worth. So it becomes if you have ESOPs which have, which are vested and are now shares, then it might make sense to diversify it, or for whatever reason, suppose, a stock has become a very large percentage of your equity allocation, then you can, sell some and diversify it. Otherwise, you should let your winners run and get out of your losers, which is actually the opposite of what most people do.
Yeah.
That
Because you're always waiting for a turnaround to
and
happen
whereas
in your
something which
losers.
has gone up, ki abhi double ho gaya, let me sell.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, you have to take an emotion out of your bond with the stock. Don't be in love with the stock. So which is why you think that I have bought something at 100, it's now 70, let it come back to 100 and then I will sell. So that again is a trap, because the market doesn't care that you bought it at 100.
And let's also talk about you spoke about the stocks which are not doing so well, but what if there are winners which are doing under index returns, kind of? Would you still continue holding them?
Yeah, I mean, if your thesis remains, I mean, there'll be leads and lags. So you can't always say that last 6 months mein outperform nahi kiya, so I should get out. So that way, again, if you're just chasing the last thing that did well, you will systematically underperform. Again, this is data. And which is why if you see, even whether it is countries, whether it is mutual fund schemes, very often the very top performing in 1 year will be somewhere near the bottom in the next year.
True.
So when you are evaluating schemes, also look at how they do in the downturns more than the bull runs. So ET had done this analysis of mutual fund schemes, and they were surprised at what came out. I was not, which was that the best performing schemes were the schemes which outperformed during downturns. And there was one scheme which I think outperformed something like 93% of the up moves, but it was almost near the bottom because it fell more when the markets fell. So that's the thing, because investing is a loser's game. You have to play it not to lose. Not to hit the sixes, that should not be the objective. Your objective is not to get out.
That's true. Capital preservation more than just focusing on,
yes,
how
because that's the
quickly
nature of the game. That's the way the game is now structured. So the winner's game and loser's game, I don't know whether we spoke about it in the last
we
podcast.
did, but we can cover it again. briefly.
Yeah. So there's a old article by Charles Ellis called The Loser's Game, and it was always part of my training manual. It's an old one, but it really opens your mind, because everything in the world is a winner's game or a loser's game. So tennis at the Grand Slam level is a winner's game. You have to play brilliantly to win. But if you are playing at your mohalla or your club, you should just keep the ball in play, and the other person will make enough mistakes for you to win. So your strategy is only not to lose, that just put the ball back. So investing now is, at once upon a time, maybe you could unearth hidden gems, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, when Excel sheets were not around, when even getting an annual report was a task. Now everybody has the data. So, and the supposedly brightest minds are putting their mind to this. So there's no way you will consistently be this genius who will unearth things which nobody has discovered. So your game has to be played not to lose. Not to lose doesn't mean that you don't book losses. In fact, you book the small losses so that you don't have the big hit on your portfolio. That's the objective, that you should not have a big drawdown on your capital, because percentages are not symmetric. If you fall 1/3, you have to go up 50% to come back to zero. If you fall half, you have to double to come back to zero. So you should not have those kind of hits on your portfolio.
When you think about, I read your article, What Not to Do in 2026. I thought that was a great reminder to people, because most people at the start of a new year are making these resolutions and thinking about what all to do. But what not to do is equally important, if not more. I would love to share those insights with the audience.
Yeah, so some of the things I've already spoken about, that, don't forget the rest of your DP statement, that go through that and grit your teeth and get rid of all the things all the garbage which should not be there. You look at conscious asset allocation, that don't forget about asset allocation in that whole thing of just trying to look for the last, best multi-bagger or stock that you can talk about. Are you structuring your equity allocation, first of all, at the level of that, are you managing it, or is a fund manager managing it? If you're managing it yourself, are you the best fund manager? So these are, many of those things are fairly simple things, but it is just, and it doesn't require willpower, it doesn't require or sustained willpower, let me say, or that you spend a lot of time every day or every week doing it. So you do an exercise for one. Don't tinker around with your asset allocation all the time. That gold chala to gold ke piche ho gaya, US did well, so let me now put money in the US tech stocks. So if you're just chasing the yesterday's story, that again becomes a problem. So those are, some of the basics you have to just do and avoid all the noise. So don't watch business television 24 hours. Don't take tips from the Telegram groups and WhatsApp groups. Because most of us research purchase of a mobile phone more than we research the purchase of a stock or a scheme. So
that's really true, because last few years, whenever I've spoken to different people at family offices, a lot of them took very significant exposure to equities, sometimes even as high as 60-80%, where they were like, we are okay to keep this capital in equities and play for the long term. But from what you're saying, that is not a healthy way to approach it, right?
No, you can allocate to equity, but then how are you managing that equity portfolio? How are you deciding where is that invested? So having 60 or 70% to equity is no problem, but how are you deciding how that is getting invested?
So then there comes the question of concentration versus diversification.
Right.
A few people I've had on the show go to the extent of saying that 5 to 10 stocks in your portfolio is all the diversification you need, but you consistently make the case for diversification, and that to 25 to 30 stocks.
Yeah,
so
if not more. Our PMS, actually the name is India Super 50, so we have about 50 to 60 stocks most of the time. But I'm saying 25-30 is about the bare minimum. And I had met a family office some time ago, and this was an elderly gentleman, and he tells me, Devina ji, पहले सब लोग ये बोलते थे कि PMS में तो 10-15 से ज़्यादा स्टॉक नहीं होने चाहिए. Now people come and tell me that there should be 40-50 stocks. So what has changed? I said, only the performance of our PMS is what they saw. But the magic is not in the number. First, you have to understand the logic, the first principle logic, why I'm saying diversification. But the investing is a game of luck and skill. Everything in life is a game of luck and skill. I can think of only chess as a game of skill alone. Everything else is a game of luck and skill. So what happens with luck and skill is that it's a game of probability. So yeah, the analogy I can give you is that if you toss a coin, now we know that there's a 50% probability of getting a head in a coin toss. But if you toss it only 10 times, maybe you will get 2 heads, maybe you will get 8 or 9 heads also. But if you toss it 100 times, you'll be close to that 50-50 number. So now this is the same thing. So if your stock picking skill is such that you are right 65% of the time, actually 60-65 is a very good hit rate. Nobody is right 90% of the time. So if you play the game enough times, which means if you are picking up enough stocks, then your real hit rate will be also close to this 65. If you are playing with 12 stocks and you're saying 5 stocks, then you are playing luck. There will be years when luck will favor you and your performance will be very good. But it is not predictable performance. It is not, because you are just playing luck, you're not playing skill. So if you're confident of your skill and if you have skill, only then this 50 stock formula will work. If you don't have skill, then it will not work. So it gets your real results close to your skill level results. So that's why I did not launch a PMS till 2020, 20 years after I had the PMS license, because I said till I have something where there's some predictability and consistency, how can I take people's money? So the system gives you that there's some predictability, which then you are playing by diversifying, because you don't want to take outsized risk, because as I said, it's a loser's game. So the more you concentrate, the more your risk is, the more the probability of a loss is. So you're not, as I said, swinging for the sixes. That you have to make sure that you don't lose big money. That's the number one objective. So you first define the risk parameters and you maximize return within that, rather than say that I'll first maximize returns, because that way you will get out. And that's the whole point.
Yeah, because I think what people don't fully understand is how much risk they're actually dealing with in different asset classes.
Right.
You've been doing it for decades, and now you're managing other people's money also. What are some mistakes you've seen people make consistently, and that still ends up surprising you that people are still doing this?
Yeah, I mean, this is some of the things we've already spoken about. But since before coming to equity, since you spoke about risk, sometimes people are not cognizant of risk in fixed income. So when you see, the whole purpose of fixed income is to reduce volatility and risk of your portfolio. So we, for example, whether in India or overseas, for any of our fixed income or multi-asset products, we do not take any single credit risk. So we will never buy a bond of a company, because that means that if that company goes bust, there is that portion will go to zero in your portfolio. So that kind of risk I don't want to take. So I will always take pooled risk. So I mean, let's say I'm buying a investment grade bond ETF, or I'm buying a ETF that invests in government bonds across the world, or whatever, but it's pooled. It is not one government or one company. So that, or even what are, like, for example, in fixed income, these credit funds.
Yeah, there's been a huge flood of those also in the market.
Yeah, so remember that anybody who's getting money from these fixed income funds is typically someone who is not able to meet the norms for a bank. Because so that, I mean, that's the truth of the matter.
Yeah.
So these are high risk borrowers typically, and it becomes in effect a Ponzi scheme, because you are lending long term and yet you are saying that I will provide daily liquidity. So how will you provide daily liquidity? The daily liquidity is coming only when the new money keeps coming in to pay off someone who's asking for money. And if that stops, your actual assets can't pay you back in a day. So there's a inherent anomaly in this. And the other thing is, see, when you're depositing with the bank is also lending out, but in between is the bank. So if one borrower defaults, it doesn't come out of your deposit. People think fixed income mutual funds is a substitute for fixed deposit, but they don't understand this, that in a fixed deposit you are not directly exposed to the borrower. That if one borrower of a bank defaults, it doesn't affect your deposit until the bank's capital is eroded, etc., etc. Whereas here, even one borrower defaults, it comes out of your NAV. Those are the risks. I mean, in equity side, as I said, first people play fast and loose with their money. That whatever, even if it's a simplified system that you're following, that I want to buy stocks which meet this margin or this growth or this return criteria, even if you have 5 ratios that you want to look at least keep to that. Because what I find is people might say this, but when you look at their actual portfolio, those don't meet any of those norms, because that you bought because somebody on a Telegram group said something, you heard something on TV and you bought it. So don't play like that. So follow some reasonable system. And if you are deciding whether you should invest yourself or give it to a professional, I'd done one of my Mint columns on this, that should you be a DIY investor. It's a chapter in my book also here. And so which is really, look at it as a framework where you are another fund manager. So when you're evaluating 5 other fund managers, you are fund manager number 6. And then look at the performance of all the fund managers, and you, not just those 3 stocks that you bought that did very well, but what happened to all the stocks that you have bought. and whether you are the best fund manager there is. And if you feel that fine, मतलब but ये तो बहुत boring हो जाएगा, फिर party में जाके क्या बोलेंगे कि I'm invested in 5 mutual funds and that's it. तो कुछ तो करना पड़ेगा. तो then you keep some play money, have some 10-20% for yourself to learn or to be able to talk at parties, but don't manage the bulk of your money, because most people have a day job or they have a business to run, and they're not doing it full time, whereas the fund managers are doing it full time. They have a team to support them, all of that. So really be objective first of all on whether you are the best fund manager for your money.
That's true, because in most people's allocations, they don't really question the fund manager that much. I've seen. What are the right questions to ask a fund manager when you're evaluating them?
Okay, so when you're talking to a fund manager, every fund manager will give you a grand presentation on how they pick stocks to buy, right? Ask them when they sell. What is the risk management? And then you will come to know how deeply they have thought about it. Because everybody has an excellent story to say on how they pick stocks. But when do they get out of the stocks? What is the criteria for that? How do they manage the risk? Those questions are what you should concentrate on, because see, we talk about active and passive investing. Now, passive investing sounds as if it is low risk, but that's not the truth. Of course, passive investing in a sense is also active in the sense somebody is deciding on that index. That index is not coming from heaven.
Yeah.
So it is an active decision by someone. But I mean, leaving that aside, the real value add by an active fund manager is mainly risk management. That when the market tanks 30%, your portfolio doesn't tank 30%. That's the main value add of an active strategy. So, I mean, for example, during COVID time, most funds went down 35-40%. Our India and global funds were down 8 to 10%. So it need not even be a cash call. At that time, of course, we had exited equity in large portions, especially in our global multi-asset products. But otherwise, there are also other alternatives like hedging. So, but something to protect the capital when things are uncertain.
What were the reasons for you selling before the crash? Were the signals that you read?
Yes, I mean, it is there on my Twitter feed. On February 2, 2020, I tweeted saying something very strange is happening. Schools had shut down in Japan and Italy. And for the first time, you saw those tourist attractions of Rome without a person inside. This is very strange. This is like really unprecedented, because this did not happen during World Wars or anything. And we went totally risk averse. So in a that's the reason we like the flexibility of a multi-asset product, that normally in our global multi-asset products, we have something like 75% or 80% equity. At that time, we went to less than 10%. We moved to investment grade bonds. It's another matter that investment grade bonds also fell in the crash. But then, as I said, the fall was only about 8% or so, not the 35-40% that other funds did. But in such cases, you also have to get back in very quickly. So again, on Twitter, on 23rd February, we tweeted seeing time to be 23rd. This was 2nd March and 23rd March. So within 3 weeks.
Right.
So 23rd March, we tweeted time to be back. And by end of March, we were again fully invested. And if we had not, by end of February, the markets were up 28-30% from the lows, both India and global. So if you missed that, you missed it. So that's the thing. Most of the time, it makes sense to remain invested. But as I said, when we are uncertain, we buy insurance in the form of puts, in the form of hedges, which of course at times just costs you money, but that's like insurance. So like last year at election result time, we were hedged, which ultimately did not come out to be useful. But that's like saying your health insurance was useless because you were not hospitalized in that year. So we are still happy with the decision of having hedged.
And you were saying about the questions to ask fund managers. What other factors?
So this is the part in which you have to probe that when do you sell? What is your risk management process? Of course, you listen to what they are saying on the.
Because they all have such fancy pitch decks.
So that's why I say everybody has a pitch deck on how they buy.
Yeah.
But people often have not thought through when they sell and what the risk management is it.
That's very interesting here. I would love to ask you 2 questions. One, then, is the future of investing completely without a human in the loop? Okay, can we rely on these machines and AI to do investing for us? And secondly, like, when you think about these systems that you get insights from, what are some of the parameters or the signals that the system is trained to look at?
Okay. First of all, I mean, we use what we call a human plus machine system. So it's not that the machine gives a black box output and we go and buy that. No, I mean, and not only that, whatever is the machine's output, suppose a company's rank has gone up or down significantly, we can always go back and see which factor has changed for the company. So, I mean, we start with the same financial parameters that one would normally do, except that you can look at more nuanced versions of that. So, for example, we all look at growth. Now, growth is what? It's a first derivative. It's like velocity. But you can also have a second derivative of growth, which is acceleration, or a third derivative called jerk. So, then you can test everything and see where the signals are coming. And so on. So you can, and you can go in fair amount of detail. Like one of the factors we look at is total compensation to auditors, which if it is going up inordinately, when we tested it, we found that to be a relevant factor. That we found that, it signals a red flag.
Yeah.
I mean, it stopped working in the US, but in India, it still works as a signal. So that way you can test out, hundreds of parameters and come up with what is working, what is significant. So that is what it does. In fact, the systems made by pure techies don't work precisely because there's enough computing power, you can, instead of hundreds, you can test, millions of factors. And if you do that, you will find some which appear to work, but which are where the correlation is spurious. So one of the disciplines we follow is that we define the factors and then test them. We are not asking the system to just generate x to the power of 3 plus square root of y divided by the cube root of z, which is, and if you test like that, you will find some things which appear to work. And once they appear to work, you will make up a story why makes sense.
Yeah.
But so therefore, there are many checks and balances in the whole thing. So, and therefore you need the humans with the expertise. That's at one level, at the coding level. The other is that even after the system gives the output, you have to look at it. Like, for example, there are companies where the system might like it, but when you go into the details, where are they exporting, who are they selling to, maybe there's a risk here, so I don't want to buy. But there has to be a concrete reason. So, or the other reason why we might overrule something is that, again, too much of sector concentration, that we don't want to buy 40% of the 40% of the portfolio in a single sector. Or liquidity, while the system is checking for liquidity, we again manually check for liquidity. That we don't want to show paper profits, that we want to see that if you actually want to sell, can you sell? On the down days, is there volume? All of that. So those are the human elements. But as I said, the plus of a machine is that it can analyze a lot, and without bias and without randomness. Human beings are very random. I mean, there's studies showing that judges, if you want bail from a judge, don't go before lunch, go after lunch. There's a hugely significant difference between the two.
Yeah, that's very interesting, right? Because like if you think about sector concentrations also, there have been so many pockets of sectors that have been in the news of late. But the ones that are in the news are promising, like are definitely going to underperform. So then what are some of the sectors that you personally are bullish on? Or are there any sectors or pockets where you see that they are undervalued currently?
So we, as I said, we look at rebalancing every quarter. So every quarter we will run all our systems and otherwise also look at everything and say that today if I had cash, where will I be? So in actual fact, from one quarter to the other, the answer is 85-90% same. The stocks may be 85-90% the same, but still you will ask that question. So whatever I'm telling you may not hold for, I don't know how long it will hold. So as of now, where we are overweight, where we've been overweight now almost 2 years, has been auto components, which actually did pretty well last year. Pharma, healthcare, which actually did do that well in 25. But we've been overweight there. FMCG, we've become overweight in 25. Banking, while not overweight, we are holding more than we normally do. So
you always say you're a nervous investor in banks.
Yes.
That stayed with me. I've thought about that.
I mean, it's a structure of banking. It is not that it's a leveraged business, it's a business where inherently you will always have more negative surprises than positive surprises, because as a lender, what is your upside? If your borrower does very well, they're not going to give you anything extra. You are only going to get your principal plus interest. But they do very well, they will probably say reduce the interest rate. And sitting outside, you have no idea what is in the credit book or in the trading book of the bank. So it is like you are on a hope and a prayer that the management is doing the right thing. So that
Coming back to auto and pharma, since you took those two names, I think auto, you can see that there's a structural trend possibly that Indian consumption is picking up. So is FMCG, right? But then when it comes to pharma, because obviously of the US tariffs, etc., a lot of these companies have been very poorly hit. So then, at what point do you rebalance
So
or shuffle?
pharma, our exposure is more to the domestic oriented companies, not as much to the
Got
export
it.
oriented. However, the large exporters to the US, most of them do have plants there. So, they are meeting that requirement which Trump had said that, that they should have plants there. So most of the larger producers do have plants there too. That was the thing. And FMCG, I mean, it's been a kind of turnaround from low consumption numbers in GDP, the consumption, private consumption low. People started talking about it end of 2024 because that's when the market went down. But the low in the consumption was actually in 23-24. It was a 21-year low. So by that time, it had started to tick up, which has ticked up further. Also, inflation has come down. So all the food stuff which was crowding out the FMCG in the household budget, this time not only has food inflation come down, food prices have come down. So there's been more room in the household budget. Of course, in India, it is not a one-way street because I think 46% of the population is dependent on agriculture. So you will have food prices coming down means the income for rural households come down. So it's like a bit of a balancing act. But on the other hand, crude prices have come down, petrochemical therefore have come down. So it is a positive on the margin front also. So it's like a positive thing on the revenue and a positive thing on the margin.
So you believe similar to FMCG, even the auto trend will continue?
I mean, for now, as I said, now it's been almost 2 years. We of course started with being quite overweight on auto components. So beginning of 24 onwards, we were overweight auto components, and then slowly autos also we became overweight. So for now, it is continuing, but it's been 2 years. It's not like something which we are starting now. So let us see how long it lasts.
Any sectors that you feel are very overhyped, but I promise I don't look like they'll deliver?
It's difficult to say. I mean, there are sectors like real estate, which we normally steer clear of because of the risks that it's like highly volatile and risky, rather than saying that it's too expensive.
Right. But thank you so much, Devina. I think this was a fantastic chat. We've given the audience an overview of what not to do, what to think about when you're assessing frame portfolios, thinking about fund managers, and how to choose sectors as well. So I wish you all the best. Your book is already a national bestseller, and you just shared with me that you're going to work on another book. So all the best, because
Thank
even
you.
last year when you'd come on the show, I think this was the first time you had announced that you were writing a book and it was ready to get published. So I wish you phenomenal success again, and hope
Thank you.
you get another national bestseller.
Thank you.
All
Love
the
it.
best.